Okay, hi everybody, and welcome back to the panel that we have here today for the Indigenous Health session. Just like to, thank the fantastic speakers that we've just heard from. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Walker, Mr. Andrew Sporle and Associate Professor Ray Lovett, who are joining us on our panel today. We're very privileged to have them here to be able to talk with and ask questions, so please feel free to put questions up onto the chat. Leaders in the space of Indigenous data sovereignty. And I might just start by asking each of you to talk a little bit about what's been happening in this space since 2018, the last Indigenous Population Health Data Linkage Network Conference. And I might hand over to Dr. Walker to start with. Thank you.
Thank you. So since 2018, I think actually the conversation has matured in Canada a little bit around data sovereignty. We're hearing more and more Indigenous organizations talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, as well as actually the holders of data talking about Indigenous data sovereignty and what it means. In the last, I would say even in 6 months, the sort of energy around that and the willingness to think about it has been really acute. And I think part of it has to do with the pandemic, actually. It's really shone a light on where those data governance relationships are there and established, and those relationships have been established over many years. Data around the pandemic and COVID could flow easily and be actually used for governance, like that Indigenous organizations could use it to make decisions and communities could use it to make decisions. Where that sovereignty hadn't been recognized and the governance wasn't established yet, the data is not able to flow to support decision making in the pandemic. So I think that has really highlighted the importance of Indigenous data sovereignty and data linkage in general. So I think it's really just highlighted a lot of gaps and a lot of strengths, actually. I think actually Indigenous data sovereignty conversations are accelerating in Canada.
Excellent, thank you. That's great to hear, Jennifer. Andrew, we'll move on just to hear from how things have been progressing in New Zealand.
In Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's been going remarkably fast, and somewhat we're struggling a little bit to keep up, but it's actually been very, very good news. First of all, the government agreed to start a co-governance discussion over all official statistics with Indigenous leaders. So while that was being negotiated, we had a census failure here in New Zealand, which led to a really huge undercount of the Indigenous Māori population by about 60. So the inclusion rate was only about 69%. And it was really, really bad. And they couldn't give tribal data, for example. It wasn't good enough. And the results took, they had to do a big panel beating job and patchwork job to try to correct the data using from other sources, including linked data. But as a result of that, that generated a big discussion about the value of data. And so data governance and this failure of the census and the failure of the governance processes meant that data governance came to the fore. So that the data sovereignty discussions started cropping up everywhere. So much so that the same language was being used in policy agencies. So we were getting requests actually from government policy agencies. How do we do this? So where it's at the moment is that we've managed to get it on the agenda as a result of this discussion, but also it's been normalized as an expectation through a combination of research funding and ethics review, because people are saying this is actually best practice now. and then people engaging with these policy agencies and creating policy stakeholder informed policy on the hoof that has filled this policy void. So even our big agencies are now saying that data sovereignty is the way to go, and they're looking at ways to do it. So we've got like it's a little bit easier in New Zealand because we have a single federal system. But even at our largest ministries like education or social development, they're actually looking at turning their data systems around so they can service local communities and make their data accessible and relevant to local communities. So it's the talk of it's been normalised, and we're just realising different ways to actually act it and make it happen. But it's a really exciting time.
Fantastic. It's interesting how a failure sets off something that is actually quite positive. That's fantastic to hear. Ray, we'll turn to you now with regards to Australia.
Yeah, so there's probably been four big things that have happened in Australia. So the first was the development of the Indigenous data sovereignty principles, which actually occurred in later 2018 through a primarily Indigenous convened group. And so through the Mayamnari Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective. So there was a workshop convened, and out of that workshop was developed the local principles of Indigenous data sovereignty. So that was the first thing. Shortly thereafter, there were increasing calls, like Jennifer and Andrew have indicated, for guidance, particularly by government institutions and agencies, whether they were state, territory-based or federal, around what is Indigenous data sovereignty. So there's been a big kind of increase in agencies and organisations and community as well wanting to understand what Indigenous data sovereignty is. So there's been lots of work going on there. And now we're moving into this phase where people are really interested in what does it look like? What do we need to do? The application. And I think that's where things will go in the future. The third really important element that's just occurred as well is the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies have done a review of their ethical framework. And for many of us, that's the ethical framework we look to around doing our human research. And within that revised ethical framework is inclusion of Indigenous data sovereignty principles as a part of the ethical framework. So it is now embedded within that ethical practice and framework. I guess there's also been quite an increase around the talk, as I mentioned, around data sovereignty, but there is currently an exposure draft of a piece of legislation in Australia, which is, I guess, a good thing and a bad thing, in that it's around data release and reuse. And so the government is trying to be more transparent or make data more available. But of course, given our history, that comes with inherent risks. And while we've been trying to engage in the process to say that anything, any processes need to have Indigenous data sovereignty or governance processes embedded in that framework, today that hasn't been adopted. So that draft is currently out for comment. So there's some concerns about that, but it also creates opportunity, because if Indigenous organisations in Australia are wanting to link or repatriate data, there may be an opportunity under this framework or this legislative framework that's coming. So I think they're the four big things. A lot of those things have happened in the last sort of year, I guess, in that there's been quite a lot of movement.
Thank you. Yes, and we're definitely experiencing that in the research sector, sort of here in South Australia anyway, where I am. So with this, and it sounds like it's happening in all three countries, and so with the sort of increase in people's understanding and sort of drive and want to be able to implement the principles, what are some of the there's opportunities obviously for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers and communities to be more involved without having to justify why, which is what we've been doing for such a long time, which is a great outcome of the principles. But what are then some of the things that we need to be thinking about to ensure that we can actually respond to this increase in the want to collaborate? Because obviously we want to get it right. We don't want to just have sort of a token governance, say, structure or token sort of input. And there's only so many of us, but there's a whole lot of community. So at all different levels, what are some of the things that we should be looking towards in the way of building our ability to respond and fully participate in this area? Jennifer, would you like to start?
Sure. Oh, I get to start twice.
Ladies first.
Yeah, so there's a lot to think about there. A lot of focusing on building community capacity to be able to respond, to be able to participate, and to be able to drive the questions that are asked with the data, so that it's not always a position of responding, right? It's not always a position of those priorities being driven elsewhere and then having the capacity to respond. I think one of the things we did early when we linked to the First Nations data in Ontario, one of the things we did early was like kind of pause and let a few projects happen, first with the data that were driven by the Chiefs of Ontario, who was the one that brought that linked data in. So we focused on a few projects, got things worked out, developed systems, but created that space. And it was actually hard as someone who was working, sort of with community, from community, in community, but also in the institution that held the data. I was part of that sort of like building a dam to keep back the pressure on the communities who are trying to use data for governance. It's not just asserting governance, the governance principles over the data, but finding that space to learn to use the data for governance. And so I think that part of what I saw my role as doing was just like maintaining that space for community to work with the data first, and then slowly, even though people are impatient, slowly building the structures from the community up so that the data governance was in place in the way that it needed to be in place. So I think it's about, I know there's a lot of pressures, I know there's so many questions to be answered, but I think those questions just really have to come at the right time from the right place.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that. And that's an interesting point that you make there as well, with regards to, it's not just about governance of the data, but it's also about learning to use the data for governance, which is one of the ultimate outcomes that we want from this, to be able to contribute to our self-determination. Yeah, very good. We'll come back to that point, I think, in the discussion. I'll move to Andrew. Andrew, just with regards to the same question, what are some of the sort of challenges or things that we need to be doing to ensure that we're, able to fully participate in this movement?
The area that I work in is in systems change and changing the official statistics system so it can face local communities. And there, it's actually been an issue of not expecting too much. And so what our approach to date has been setting up pilot projects that then could be exemplars for others to follow. And those others would be other communities or other agencies. But also negotiating the gap between communities and the holders of data and government, so that the government doesn't go too fast. That, you know, saying this is a pilot project. It's not about speed. You just have to do it well, right? And well is better than rushed, and because we can't go backwards if we want to set a really good example. So we've been doing that and reorientating data systems around, making the holders of the systems know that means that we need different ways of defining ourselves, different ways of finding areas and aggregating data around areas, and different ways of accessing data. And that's been really, really important, because that way we can actually get external eyes on what the government has, and therefore say, well, this is what you should have but don't have, and this is what you have but shouldn't have, and this is what you should probably never get, right? And this is going to all be ours. So actually, once we actually turn the data around so people can see what's in it about themselves, then they can say, well, actually, we can now shape our future because we can see where things are. But that reorientation is done sort of bit by bit, project by project, but with the intention of creating examples for others to follow.
Excellent, thank you. And does that look, so if we just use the access to the data as an example, does it look different to what it traditionally is, in the way of, you know, how we apply to access our information through a data custodian, for example? Does that look different in the way in which it's done in some of these pilot projects, or is it similar?
Yes, it does. There's a combination of similar and there's a combination of different. And the different, one of the ways of doing it different was using Indigenous defined areas to cut up the data. But there, what we had to negotiate first was that the intellectual property for those areas belonged to the Indigenous people, so they set the rules for how that gets used. So if that data tool goes into the system, right, it is under the control or at least it has to be in accordance with rules as set down by the Indigenous owners of that intellectual property. And other systems other approaches have been taking the same systems, but putting them in local communities, putting data portals in local communities. But there we actually still need to address the issue that Jennifer raised, that we need translators, data translators and data skills in those local communities to assist them. But if you put the portal in the community, then the communities can bring in the researchers to assist them, rather than the community members having to go to where the data portal is. So, yeah, if you locate the access to the resources in the communities, then the data nerds will follow.
Excellent. Thank you. Ray?
Yeah, I was just going to reinforce that very important distinction that Jennifer raised. You know, we're talking about two different but complementary things here around for Indigenous data sovereignty: the governance of data and data for governance. So our work here is around both of those things. And I noticed one of the comments in the chat goes to the point around data for governance. So, you know, what drives the questions, and to be able to do that work, data literacy is extremely important. So knowing what you need to know, knowing the language of statistics and data is extremely important. So we do some work around that through the work that I do. And then increasing that capability, you know, that Andrew mentioned as well. So it's about realizing Indigenous data capability in communities as well, not just communities, everywhere really, because then that helps with decision making. And the portal stuff also mentioned by Andrew, but I know in Canada they do this as well. Having that available in communities for decision making is extremely important. On the data governance of data, so all these researchers and public institutions really want us to work on the other thing, which is the governance of their data. I'm less interested in that, to be honest with you. But some of my thinking and some of my Ngāri Wingara thinking around this is, what do these institutions and organisations understand best? And for me, when I think about that, it's around standards and accreditation mechanisms. So if we put in place Indigenous data governance standards or authority, which is an application of those principles, how do you apply it? How do you demonstrate that you have these systems, going to Andrew's point about changing systems? How do you demonstrate that you have these things in place? And if you meet them, you will have some form of accreditation standard in a formal sense. So I think in Australia, or our group's thinking more about not heading things off, but if we go down that path that people understand, because they're currently doing it, I know we do it in healthcare quite a lot, is that if we have standards in place that are applied versions around policies and procedures for Indigenous data sovereignty principles, that may be a solution. But that requires an organisation or a structure as well, which is something like an Indigenous data authority, where those standards are developed and set. Because again, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need to be in control of these standards and how they get developed. So that's just some of the thinking, but both of those elements are extremely important.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Ray. I'm just going to change tact a little bit here. I know that a lot of people are really interested in the identification of Indigenous data, but also the comparison that we're often compared with the non-Aboriginal population. And I just wanted to ask you, we've got 7 minutes, and just to ask each of you to pick one of those areas and to talk a little bit about some of the nuances with regards to those. Jennifer, I might not... Okay, I will start with you. Go for it. Thank you.
I was all ready.
You were wonderful.
So, there's a lot to say about these. I could probably speak for more than 6 minutes myself, but I'll try not to. I think in Canada, we've done a lot of work around linking registries, like linking Indigenous registries to health services data and other data. And that's how we've been identifying Indigenous people. There are other ways of identifying Indigenous people in the data, and they mean different things. And so there's a lot of nuance around that in Canada for sure, because there aren't as many opportunities for people within data structures to self-identify as Indigenous. And so introducing those things, and as I mentioned before, the pandemic creates a sense of urgency, and suddenly governments want to be able to report on how many Indigenous people are being tested, how many people are positive, and they can't because they haven't been collecting Indigenous identity data. And so they rely on those linkages that are under the control of Indigenous organizations, but those mean something different from what the government's looking for, actually. So I think that it's really important to understand what the method of identification and what it means and who has governance over it in all of that flow. So yeah, that's what I'll say about that. Thanks for that.
Wonderful, thank you. And we know here in Australia, which is one of the presentations today focused, that you were chairing the panel as well, Jennifer, was that there are different people who identify us in the data set. So particularly using some work I've done recently with a team from the University of Adelaide, if we look at children, the perinatal data set, people reporting Indigenous identity are usually the midwives, and then we might have the mother and the father, and it's not until later in life that the child themselves reports and, you know, who it's based on. So we get these inconsistencies once we start to link the data and whose voice do we privilege in all that. So that's one of the things that we're working through continually as well within these linked data sets. I'll go to you, Andrew.
We have different systems in New Zealand, so, but the first most important point is that the tribal identification system is completely separate from the government one. And with one notable exception, to my knowledge, no tribes are doing data linkage on their own data. But that tribe is one that has actually got a proactive genealogical tree. So they've actually tracked everybody from 2 censuses in the 1850s, or 1848 and 1851, I think it is. Otherwise, in the official statistics, we have 2 ways of being identified. One is by self-declared descent, and the other is self-declared ethnic affinity. Health, education and welfare use the ethnicity variable. A lot of the legal contexts, like voting and things, use the descent variable. And there's quite a significant, about a 15% difference in the size of those populations. So we have these 2 different definitions going on, but they are self-determined, right? So nobody is filling out those forms for you. In linked data, what they've done is they've done a single reference ethnicity table in our linked data, and that uses the best quality source of ethnicity data that's available for each individual. And you can link it, you can link into that source if you want to, but you don't have to. You can use the ethnicity variable that's in your source data set.
Thank you, Andrew. And Ray, we've got 2 minutes, so I'll ask you.
I'll do the comparison.
I'm very sorry.
No, that's all right. It's my favourite one, the comparison one. So my advice to anyone doing work, you know, or research or analyses, think about what is the intent. Is the focus of the population analysis for Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, First Nations people? If it is, comparisons are usually not necessary. And particularly for reporting, if we're thinking about progress, or what we call a progress frame, then as soon as you start referring or deferring to the non-Indigenous population, you lose the ability to track progress. So that's very important, where we've had a 10% decline in smoking over the last 10 years, but the relative rate has not changed between the Indigenous, non-Indigenous populations. So people think nothing has changed, but there has been a substantial decline. So it's very important. We just released a paper on this around strengths-based approaches to reporting. So my advice would be for people to look at that. The other thing I'd say about identification is, again, where that question about what is our truth in terms of a register. I know in Canada and New Zealand we have some tribal registries. We do not have that in Australia, but we should always be going or privileging Indigenous voice, and that's where people self-nominate their identity, not other forms of, you know, because then you've got arbitrary people making decisions about that.
All right, fantastic. Look, you know, these are really huge topics, and as each of you have pointed out, we could spend all day on just one of those and a lot longer. I have a whole conference dedicated to it, I'm sure. Look, I'd just like to thank each of you, Andrew, Jennifer and Ray, for being on the panel and for sharing your insights and experiences in this space, and you know, for continuing to be real leaders for all of us here. So thank you so much.